There's only one type of person who celebrates the image of Che Guevara in this day and age. Ignorant, privileged people who think that his face looks cool on a t-shirt, but who know nothing about the terrible person that he really was, the abominable things that he did, and the suffering of his tens of thousands of innocent victims. Once informed about this by far more knowledgeable and intelligent people who enlighten them with facts, reason, and logic, these naive, ignorant Che fans have no choice but to immediately repent and apologize. What other option does one have when confronted with the objective wrongness of their ways? Or at least that's what many people seem to think. Some of whom are very invested in promoting that simple idea of Che Guevara's legacy, from oil billionaire-funded conservative propaganda outlets to mainstream American sitcoms. Here's a clip from the latter, what is meant to be a comedy series, the show One Day at a Time. It's the perfect example of how desperately this view of Che Guevara is pushed. The creators just straight up wrote in a straw man that is exactly what I just described.
What the hell are you wearing?
Oh, Che Guevara? Yeah, viva la revolucion, am I right?
You are wrong.
Do you have any idea?
I got this.
Do you have any idea?
Kids, relax.
Do you have any idea what this come mierda did?
Grew an awesome beard and modeled for t-shirts?
First of all, he wasn't even Cuban. He was Castro's right-hand man.
He burned books, he banned music, he personally oversaw execution squads, he was a mass murderer.
But he has a cool hat.
It's like if you walked into a Jewish home wearing a Hitler shirt.
Or into Taylor Swift's home wearing a Kanye shirt.
Oh my God, you guys, I am so sorry.
Haha, funny and true, right? No, it's neither. Firstly, this view of Che Guevara simply doesn't hold up to the evidence. I've gone into it in detail in two longer videos of mine. The gist of them is that the Che as Hitler sort of idea is the complete opposite of reality, to the extent that its proponents have to invent events that never happened and things that he never said in order to construct it. And on the odd occasion that they do actually cite something real, the context shows it to be absolutely nothing like what they claim. Secondly, their idea of the kind of people who celebrate him and what he represents to them as a symbol is even more disconnected from reality. The fact is that perceptions of Che are overwhelmingly positive worldwide, and in Latin America and Cuba especially, quite opposite to the world presented in that sitcom, where he's basically the devil for Latinos. After Che Guevara's death in 1967, he immediately became a global symbol of liberation, of hope, of resistance. That's why there's murals of him absolutely everywhere. In the favelas of Brazil, on the streets of India, in plazas in Argentina, on the walls of wooden shacks in Mexico, alongside the faces of local heroes in Ireland, in university squares that bear his name in Colombia, on dividing walls in Palestine. A town where Che lived for a short time proudly announces it on their welcome billboard. A football club for children in poverty is named for him and bears his image on their kit. A shantytown's community ambulance displays his face on its side. A university has his face in its logo. A community education program in a poor neighborhood awards the Che Guevara People's Degree. There's statues celebrating him in places that he lived, visited, and worked. Streets are named for him in many countries, including Mexico, South Africa, and Algeria. People protesting against injustice everywhere use him as a symbol, from Yemen to Thailand to Turkey to Lebanon to Indonesia. In the town in the Bolivian Andes where Che was murdered, residents pray to him as some kind of syncretic saint, someone who, like Jesus, gave up everything to fight for people like them. The inscription on their monument to him reads, "Your example lights up a new dawn." And there's nowhere where he's more revered than in Cuba itself, the country that Che is most often associated with because of his prominent role in its revolution in 1959. There, pictures of Che adorn the walls in people's homes, and his face is on every second street corner. In a vote on the most culturally important Latin Americans in history, Che placed 37th, ahead of other legends like the Mexican revolutionary leader Miguel Hidalgo and larger-than-life Brazilian footballer Pelé. And possibly the best singular example of his passing from man to legendary hero is simply his Spanish moniker, El Che. He's not simply Che, he's the Che. I could easily go on for a lot longer here, but the point's already clear. Not only is the idea that Che Guevara was some sort of hated tyrant in life just factually wrong, but the worldwide perception of his legacy is the exact opposite to the one that some, especially in the USA, desperately try to push. There's much better analogies to be used here than the laughable Hitler one presented in the sitcom. One would be Abraham Lincoln, known by most for the Emancipation Proclamation, but hated and reviled for it by Southern slave owners and their descendants. The comparison here is very, very apt, mind you. The Che as Hitler idea originates, in large part, from those who left Cuba because their massive estates were confiscated and the people who they had worked as slaves were liberated following the revolution. Them branding him as Hitler is pure projection. So, why are they still so obsessed with attacking the legacy of a man who died in the 60s? Why do they lie about him and deny the observable reality of what he means to people while claiming to speak for all Latin Americans, all Cubans, and even the entire world? Why is it so important to them to convince others of the same? Why is this tiny minority of people constantly handed prominent platforms by the world's most well-funded media outlets? Well, because apart from simple sour grapes from the oppressors whose festivities he helped to end, the legend of Che Guevara is very dangerous for the powerful, and I'm gonna tell you why. Hi, I'm Bad Empanada. Welcome to my YouTube channel. If you like what you've seen so far, make sure to subscribe for more. Ernesto Guevara was born in Argentina in 1928. His family was well off, and so he enjoyed all of the privileges that entailed, and did all of the things that were expected of a youngster of such status. He went to elite schools, played rugby and chess, studied the classics, traveled extensively, and aspired to become a doctor. But in 1951, his life took a turn from the standard, when at the age of 23, he took a year-long trip across South America with his friend, Alberto Granado. Together, they rode a motorcycle through Argentina and Chile. Then, after it broke down, they continued on, hitchhiking through Peru, Colombia, and Venezuela. This was a very similar gap year trip to those often taken by young, well-off people today. But unlike those who simply shrug and move on afterwards, Guevara was profoundly bothered by the reality that he saw, a continent absolutely riddled with poverty and injustice. After the trip, he wrote in his diary, "I'm not me anymore. Or at least, I'm not the same me that I was before. This aimless wandering through our great American continent has changed me more than I thought it would." Rather than simply going home, returning to normalcy, and settling into a comfortable, well-paying medical career, he decided to instead do what little he could to change the world. That little turned out to be a lot. After receiving his medical degree, he set out on another trip, this time through Central America. While in Guatemala, he saw the land reform campaign of the recently elected president, Jacobo Arbenz, which involved the expropriation of unused land owned by large companies, such as the American United Fruit Company, for redistribution among poor, landless peasants. Happy to have found a country which was doing something to remedy the kinds of injustices that had bothered him so much, Guevara decided to settle in Guatemala permanently. It was around this time that he was given his famous nickname due to his frequent use of the interjection Che, common in his native Argentina. His time in Guatemala was, however, short-lived. The next year, Arbenz was overthrown in a military coup orchestrated by the US government. Known to be a supporter of Arbenz, Che was marked for death by the new dictatorship and had to flee to Mexico. This solidified his journey from starry-eyed medical student to revolutionary. He had now seen firsthand the violent fate that so often befell those who tried to fight poverty and injustice, those who dared to stand up to the capitalist elite. In Mexico, Che met exiled Cuban revolutionaries. Chief among them was one Fidel Castro. Cuba at the time was ruled by the brutal, US-backed, right-wing dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista, who ensured through violence and coercion that its economy continued to be dominated by American companies and large landowners. Che's new Cuban comrades were planning to return to their home nation and start a rebellion, and after what he'd seen across Latin America, and especially in Guatemala, Che didn't need much convincing of the idea that overthrowing someone like Batista was a worthy cause. In late 1956, after years of preparation, their plan was finally put into action. They landed on the shores of Cuba with 82 men. There, they were ambushed immediately by Batista's army. Only 22 survived. Yet those 22 revolutionaries, over the course of the next 3 years, managed to recruit so many peasants and workers from the countryside that they eventually became a formidable army, able to go toe-to-toe with the armed forces of the Cuban government. Che Guevara himself was core to this success. He used his medical training to provide free care to poor people, many of whom had never even seen a doctor before, and personally taught many of them to read. Actions like these endeared the rebels to the downtrodden and abandoned population, so there was no shortage of willing recruits. Che eventually ended up leading his own division, becoming a capable soldier and commander in his own right, despite the fact that he had crippling asthma, which made prolonged physical activity potentially fatal. In this capacity as a commander, Che was responsible for ordering the executions of a few spies and informants. The unfortunate reality of the situation was that the guerrillas numbered in the low dozens. Just a single defeat or a few casualties could have spelled their end, and so any information given to government troops was an existential threat. The dictatorship had long been torturing and murdering anyone suspected of even sympathizing with the rebels. Che personally commanded the pivotal rebel victory at the Battle of Santa Clara in 1959. Afterwards, Batista fled the country and the capital was captured the next day. There, the revolutionaries were greeted by the people as liberating heroes. The country had been devastated by the brutality of the previous government, and many demanded justice, so a tribunal was formed to try its countless criminals. Some of these trials took place at the La Cabaña prison. There, Che Guevara oversaw the proceedings. He was not actually involved in the trials themselves. Rather, he reviewed appeals in the same way that a state governor would. Around 50 to 100 people were executed at La Cabaña. Since the death penalty was not on the table for civilians, all of them were members of Batista's military and police force who were convicted of war crimes, torture, or murder. At the time, their guilt was even acknowledged by the US government. This number represented but a small fraction of those guilty of horrible crimes under the Batista regime, which had murdered 20,000 Cubans and tortured countless more. What happened at La Cabaña is the chief piece of evidence that the anti-Che crowd use to make the sorts of ridiculous comparisons like the one from that sitcom. But the fact of the matter is, the trials there were not the Cuban Holocaust that they claim. In truth, they were the exact opposite, Cuba's Nuremberg. Che then spent a few years in the Cuban government. Most importantly, he led a land reform campaign, much like the one he'd seen in Guatemala, and an incredibly successful literacy program that raised Cuba's literacy rate from 60% to more than 90% in less than 1 year. He also participated in the defense of Cuba during the USA's failed Bay of Pigs invasion, giving him some revenge for what they'd done to Guatemala, but also making it even clearer that revolutions anywhere would face violent American resistance. Che had never planned for his stint as a government functionary to last long. Again, rather than settling for a comfortable life, this time with the addition of a position of power and a world-spanning reputation, he chose to forgo it all. Cuba had already won and defended its revolution. He'd done what he could there. There were many more oppressed peoples all over the world that he wanted to try and help. And so, in 1965, after quitting his government post, he traveled to the recently independent Congo in Africa, along with a small contingent of Cuban soldiers, to fight alongside socialists there in a civil war, again against the US-backed right wing. This venture didn't go anywhere near as well as the Cuban Revolution had, with Che blaming the failure on corruption, factionalism, and a lack of enthusiasm among his Congolese allies. He soon secretly returned to Cuba, but not to rejoin the government. Rather, he stayed in hiding while organizing a new rebellion elsewhere. In the meantime, Che's whereabouts were not publicly known. This terrified his enemies. Even before he died, he was already something of a living legend, and the Americans and their reactionary allies the world over worried that he could show up and spur a revolution anywhere at any time, like some sort of living superhero. Finally, in early 1967, Che resurfaced in Bolivia, leading a small force of about 50 volunteers in an attempt to repeat the success of the Cuban Revolution. Initially, they were very successful, winning a number of battles against the Bolivian army, but that was short-lived. The Bolivian dictatorship, terrified by Che's reputation and desperate to avoid the fate of Batista, decided to deploy most of its forces against the rebels from the very beginning, despite their low numbers. The USA also sent advisors, trainers, material support, and even some of their own soldiers to try and ensure Guevara's defeat. Additionally, local rebel groups betrayed them, reneging on support they'd previously promised, leaving Che and his fighters isolated and unable to connect with the local populace to the same extent as in Cuba. In the end, after many months of fighting, Che Guevara's group of just a few dozen were found and attacked by 2,000 Bolivian soldiers at once, with support from CIA advisors. Such a disproportionate response just shows how much of a threat he posed to them. After a futile battle against impossible odds, Che was captured. He was taken to the nearby town of La Higuera, where he was quickly executed on orders direct from Bolivia's military dictator, René Barrientos. So, why did I just tell you Che's entire life story? Well, because it's crucial to understand his legacy and what he means as a symbol. Che could have just lived an easy life with all of the comforts that anyone could reasonably ask for, but he wouldn't allow himself that luxury as long as there were others in the world who couldn't enjoy the same. He gave it all up to instead struggle to liberate others from poverty and oppression. And after seeing firsthand in Guatemala that this resulted in an incredibly violent response from those at the top of the system, he resolved to fight back, to try and overthrow it. And he had absolutely no issue with risking his own life and limb to do so. And even after succeeding in Cuba, he didn't allow himself to become complacent or placated, nor settle for a position of power and personal comfort. The suffering of the rest of the world still bothered him profoundly, so he set out twice more and eventually paid the ultimate price. As he wrote in his final letter, "Above all, always be capable of feeling deeply any injustice committed against anyone anywhere in the world. This is the most beautiful quality in a revolutionary." Che Guevara was the living embodiment of that mantra. It really describes him to a T. His dashing looks surely helped at least a little bit with turning him into the legend that he is today, as did the fact that he died relatively young after only spending a short time in government, having never made the same mistakes that often blemish the memory of other revolutionary figures. But regardless, the end result was that Che Guevara lived one of the truest revolutionary lives in history, one based around taking definitive action, leading by example, unflinching solidarity with his fellow man, and a willingness to completely sacrifice the personal, including his physical self, in the pursuit of their liberation. So, with all of this in mind, it's very easy to understand how he became such a legendary symbol of such global prominence, and why the kind of people outlined in the intro are so afraid of him, why they're so haunted by his spectre, and so desperate to delegitimize him, because Ernesto Che Guevara lives on. His death elevated him to secular sainthood. His legend inspires hope for change, helps to give the world's oppressed the strength to struggle through another day, encourages people to take action, and reminds us of the fundamental righteousness of rebellion against injustice. One doesn't need to know the specifics of the ideology or to have read the writings of Che Guevara the man to be inspired by his legend and motivated by his symbol, though maybe we'd all be better equipped to take action if we did. If everyone was so unrelenting, so willing to make personal sacrifices in the pursuit of change that benefits the majority, then the minority who are in control, whom the system serves to benefit, the very sorts who are very invested in altering our perceptions about Che Guevara, well, they'd be in big trouble. wouldn't they? And that is exactly why they attack him. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, why not subscribe? And if you want to support me, you can do so by becoming a patron on Patreon, a member on YouTube, or sending me a one-time tip on Ko-fi. Now I'd just like to thank my patrons, starting with my $25 plus patrons: Ferta Hon, Darcius B, Dusty, Benny G, Mischief and Fins, Shub, Tonga Purutu Neha, Brosnan, Robert Dilling, Jesse Hosick, Potter, A Big Mean Cat, and my $10 plus patrons: JG, Michael Strauss, Crouton and Baguette, One Trash Boy, Industrial Robot, Cincione Bresgal, Morimer, Gilezau Coin, Nico Del Sesto, Artemio Nelson, Violet Rain, Memushin, Jesse Zaleski, Young Trotsky, Insurgente, Cowboy Sonelt, Christopher Strom, Jess, Evan Ruffwell, and Jacob Pitts. Bye folks, see you next time.